Hello, thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Tom Alrich. Tom, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. I've been a long time reader of your blog. For folks that don't follow Tom Alrich's blog, definitely check that out. A lot of great information on software supply chain security, which is going to be what we talk about today. But for folks that don't follow you already or haven't heard you on some outlet, can you tell us a bit about your background?
Um, yeah, I started out as a child, and I worked my way up from there. Um, I have a degree in economics from University of Chicago, but a year I seem to have forgotten, but it was a while ago. And I studied with Milton Friedman, by the way, when I was there, so it tells you how long ago it was. But I have been in what's now the IT field, the computer field, which is what it was before IT, is since 1980. Um, and, it was more mainframe stuff and then minis. And then I got into the distributed computing or PC world and networking. And from networking, um, around 911, that was what really kind of kicked off cybersecurity. I mean, there was a lot of concern about cybersecurity in the late 90s, with the I love you virus and things like that. But it really kicked off after 911. Ironically, 911 didn't have anything to do with cybersecurity, but people started thinking, hey, you know what? We could perhaps produce similar effects by, through cyber means, and we need to protect against those. And so that's what kicked it off. And I got into more of the OT side, and then especially NERC SIP with one company I worked with, around 2000. Well, yeah, it was in 2009 that we got into NERC SIP, which was just when FERC had approved SIP version 1 and the utilities were starting to figure out. No, I'm sorry, it was 2008. And they were just figuring out how to comply with it. So I work with that. And pretty much I was NERC SIP every day, every week until about 4 years ago when there was a NERC. Basically, NERC came out with their supply chain security regulation, SIP 13, and so that's when I started. And in fact, supply chain security wasn't very big even 5 years ago, as you probably know. And so I started into that, and then working on SIP 13 compliance, and then I blossomed into just supply chain security in general, and specifically now it's been software security and S-BOMs. In particular, I had a client or still have a client who was very interested in learning what was going on and whether that was something they might want to get involved with. And believe it or not, they did become involved with it. So that got me into it. And, that's pretty much, no, it's not everything I do now. I'm still doing some NERC SIP, believe it or not, but that's the main thing I'm doing.
Yeah, you mentioned the S-BOM, which is going to be a big piece of what we talk about today. You've become one of the people I follow the most when it comes to thought leadership or just, interesting perspectives around software bill of materials, or S-BOM as we call it now. But before we dive, into the nuances and technical details and so on, for folks that don't know what an S-BOM is, what is it and why does it matter?
Yeah, an S-BOM is a machine readable list of software components, basically, in a piece of software. The reason S-BOMs are necessary is nowadays 90% of any software product you buy was not written by the company you bought it from. Microsoft Windows, Oracle products, anything like that. 90% of the stuff in software, the code, is open source. I mean, 90% is third-party components, and about 90% of those are open source. So at least 80% or 81%, I guess, to be precise, of a product is open source in particular. But the point is, risks come from, coding problems. Well, in some cases, they're not problems, because vulnerabilities are discovered all the time. So no one knows that something would be a vulnerability until it happens. But in any case, you need to know about all the risks in the software you're buying. And if you just look at the vendor right now, people just have information about the supplier themselves. And by supplier, I mean the entity that creates the software, that builds the hardware, as opposed to the vendor who might be a dealer who sells it to you, but they don't, they don't have any responsibility for the product itself. So obviously it's the supplier, which is the source of risk. And 90%, but the point is that 90% of the risks that they're selling to you, they don't even know, or they're not responsible for, because, well, even that's not the right way to say it. They should be responsible for it, but it's due to third parties. And now, fortunately, suppliers nowadays are doing a very good job, partly because of S-BOMs, of really tracking their third-party risks and mitigating them. But a lot of them, some of them aren't. And so users can't really patch vulnerabilities, but users need to know about the vulnerabilities in the software that they're buying, then, in the third party. And basically they need to bug the suppliers about them. I mean, it's really that simple. And in some cases they need to do mitigations themselves if the supplier, for whatever reason, isn't going to do a patch, or it just can't be created or something like that. The supplier should help them do that, but they don't. Well, they don't. And so it's basically, though, a way of keeping track of what's in your software and learning about it so you can learn about risks.
Yeah. So building on that, knowing that, it gives you that software asset inventory, that component inventory of what's in the software you're consuming or using. You've been writing a lot about a concept called VEX, or Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. Can you elaborate on what that is for the audience too? Like, why does that play a part in the conversation around S-BOMs?
Yeah. Well, the idea of VEX, I mean, the reason for VEX is that, what happens, you're going to get it. You get an S-BOM, you look in the NVD or another database, like OSS Index is the leading open source database. I mean, and it said 90% of components are open source. You really ought to be looking in there. But multiple databases, but you find some vulnerabilities, okay? Let's say if you find 100 vulnerabilities, and you then call up the supplier and you run down this whole list of 100 and say, well, when are you going to fix this one? When are you going to fix this one? And the supplier will tell you, well, maybe there will be a few that they will actually be planning to fix, but the rest they'll say, you know what, that's not exploitable in our product for various reasons. One, which is kind of, easy to understand, is and it's perhaps one of the bigger ones, is the fact that, a library may have 4 modules, and there's a vulnerability in one of the modules, but the supplier didn't use that module because they didn't need it. So the module's not even in their product. However, the product, the NVD tracks vulnerabilities by product. That is by, in this case, it's the component. There's really no particular difference between a product and a component. And, the idea in any product could be embedded in any other. In general, that's not really true, but in principle. So, so the NVD tracks the components, and you'll find vulnerabilities for those. But basically, usually at least 95%, or they're the only real study I've seen, and it was by a vendor, so it's hard to judge its accuracy, but was at 97% of vulnerabilities that you identify in a component are not actually exploitable. So you're going to call up the vendor and you're the supplier, and you're going to demand, when are you going to fix these 100 vulnerabilities? And they'll say, well, numbers 1 through 97 aren't exploitable. But these 3, yeah, we're going to do them next Thursday, but the problem is it's not going to be that simple. You're going to go over each one and they all have to check and, and all these things. So basically, the suppliers are really worried that, and basically the development of VEX was driven by Cisco and Oracle, and I think Hitachi as well. But, they're just worried about their helplines being absolutely overwhelmed with people calling about non-exploitable component vulnerabilities. So if they give out S-BOMs. So, that's literally hindering, unfortunately, it's not the only thing, but it's one of the primary things that's hindering distribution of S-BOMs themselves. So the idea of VEX, and I now realize that was a bad idea, was that there would be a document that would come out, produced by the supplier. And by the way, I attended the second meeting of the VEX committee under NTIA and VEX subcommittee under NTIA in the summer of 2020, and I've basically attended almost all of them since then. So I bear as much responsibility as anybody else, but the idea was that there will be a document, the supplier will tell you about vulnerabilities that aren't exploitable. Now, why? You might say, well, look, if there are 3 that are exploitable, but there are 97 that aren't exploitable, why doesn't the supplier just tell you about the 3 that are exploitable? It'll be a lot easier. Well, I hope you understand that, giving a list of exploitable vulnerabilities in your product is probably not the best thing to do, unless it's to your, to someone in your company and you're sure they're not going to leak it to anybody. But, it would just be devastating. It might put you out of business if the world knew all about your all the exploitable vulnerabilities in your product. So so for that reason, they said, well, we'll tell them about the non-exploitable vulnerabilities. Well, that's going to be a real problem. I won't go into the details, but it's going to be a real problem. So VEX currently is nowhere. Okay, it's not even defined yet. There are groups working on a definition, but even that's not going to help you. Fortunately, Steve Springett went out and basically did his own definition and put it into Cyclone DX. So Cyclone DX has VEX capability now, and it creates it has the full capability to, to create VEXs and, well, okay. Cyclone DX has all the fields you need, and then Steve's other, Steve is the co-leader of the and really the founder of the Cyclone DX project, and by far, by the way, the most creative and far-thinking person in the S-BOM world. And he in 1810, not 1810, in 2010, he developed a tool called Dependency Track, and he's the primary maintainer now. There are others doing it, but it, Dependency Track basically brings in an S-BOM. Right now, it only takes Cyclone DX S-BOMs, and it then pulls out the components, looks them up in OSS Index. He doesn't go to NVD. Now, for that reason, it doesn't have that good coverage of proprietary components, but since 90% are open source, obviously that's where the risks are. So he goes into the, OSS Index, which is database run by Sonatype, and pulls out the vulnerabilities and then displays them. And that's kind of the paradigm use case for S-BOMs for vulnerability management purposes up to a certain point. Unfortunately, the dependency track doesn't go beyond that, which other steps are needed for a real consumer tool. But this is great for developers. And Steve just found out in this year, Sonatype just mentioned to it, oh, by the way, your product is being used. And now the latest figure was 270 million. And it's higher now, probably at least 300 million. 300 million times a month to look up vulnerabilities from an S-BOM in OSS Index, okay? So, and that's just one product. So it's being heavily used, yeah. And there are all the software composition analysis products, and there are lots of products now that can do what dependency track does, which is look up vulnerabilities based on an S-BOM. So and I'm kind of going off into another topic here, but the problem is that S-BOMs are being heavily used by suppliers to find out about vulnerabilities in the products that they're building, and to take remediation. They can then pull a component out and say, hey, this is a dog, we need to get rid of that and find something better, or at least they can patch them if they can't get rid of it. So they're really using it. They're really using S-BOMs. That's the end users are not using S-BOMs. They're not asking for them, and that's kind of the nutshell of the S-BOM status right now.
Yeah, I wanted to actually pull the thread on a few things you mentioned there. One of which was kind of the state of adoption and use. And one thing you talked about is where things are in terms of tooling. We seem to have a weird situation in the sense that typically technology tends to lead regulation and policy, and regulation and policy tends to lag. It catches up to the technology, or tries the best it can to catch up to the technology. We have a weird situation where it seems like policy and regulation is actually ahead of where the technological landscape is in terms of capabilities and tooling. Why do you think that is in this case?
You're breaking up, Chris. Yeah. You might can you repeat that?
Yeah, sorry. Hopefully you can hear me a little bit better now. I said, like, typically, policy tends to lag, technology, for example, but we have a situation here where regulation and policy is actually ahead of, the tooling landscape, the technology landscape, as you talked about. Why do you think that's the case in this scenario?
Well, they're not. And it's amazing that people have that perception. What regulations are you talking about?
I'm saying in the sense that, we're seeing a big push, obviously the Cybersecurity Executive Order, efforts by NTA and CISO and others around S-BOM and VEX.
Well, but those aren't regulations. That's the point. NTA, the Executive Order is one thing. But and neither NTIA nor CISA develops regulations.
Yeah, I guess regulations.
They're very, very adamant about that too.
Yeah, regulations not the right term. I guess, we're seeing policy from federal like organizations like OMB, for example. They released 2218.
OMB is just supposedly implementing what the executive order required. But if you look at their latest memo from September, basically the executive order says software suppliers need to give an S-BOM to customers. Well, so they get one S-BOM. That's great. And maybe they've gotten it by now, the federal agencies. That's great. But, it doesn't actually say anything about suppliers because it doesn't apply to suppliers. It applies to federal agencies. The White House has no ability to regulate suppliers, but they're saying the agencies have to start asking for the S-BOMs. The supplier could tell them to go pound sand, but then the supplier is probably not in a wonderful position for further purchases from the federal government. So hopefully they will comply with that. But all they had to do was give them one S-BOM. Well, good. You got a great S-BOM, and you go and do a patch the next week, and your S-BOM's out of date. Your S-BOM has to be updated, or it should be. I mean, it won't, right now, we should be very happy to get 3 or 4 S-BOMs a year. I mean, that's 3 or 4 more than any suppliers are distributing now, as far as I know. But you know, you should have an S-BOM for every change in your software, because any change in the code, because the components are always different. You know, even if you actually don't change any of the code, if you just rerun the build a month later, some of the components will have revved in the meantime, you know, and you'll get newer versions and things with, you know, so it really, or some of the components may, you know, no longer be available or something. So the point is, a single S-BOM, S-BOMs age like milk. They don't age like fine wine.
Yeah.
And you need to dump them in a few weeks because they're really not going to be relevant.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about that. You're talking about, you know, kind of the real-time nature, and you've talked about real-time VEX in a blog article, for example. You know, in the S-BOM, in the context of maybe I'm running an on-premise piece of software from a vendor and they provide an S-BOM, but what if I'm using a cloud-native service, for example, that's being, you know, has many microservices, many iterations of its versions of its SaaS offering, for example, that are running in real time? You know, how do you see VEX and S-BOM working out in that kind of a deployment model?
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, one of the CISO work groups now, which is meeting every week on Wednesdays, is on cloud S-BOMs. And you know, basically the NTIA always knew that they had to address cloud. I mean, and when I NTIA, I'm talking about the Software Component Transparency Initiative, run by the NTIA and run by Alan Friedman. He was a one-man band at that time. You know, the idea is everything written by the initiative, you know, all the documents that are on ntia.gov/SBOM are creations of the group. Alan, you know, did a really good job of marshaling the different forces to you know, have the discussions and keep people on track. He's very good at that. And so, but we always said, and everyone agreed that, you know, yeah, cloud is a big question, but we're not going to discuss it now. Well, so when Alan came to CISA, decided now was now, and or in the future was now, and so we are discussing it now, and the meetings are really interesting, by the way, and services. The idea of the S-BOM, if you think about it, an S-BOM for on-premises software is there to protect your network. You know, you know, there will be vulnerabilities in these components. Supplier will, attacker will penetrate the component, well, penetrate the product, because it's one of the 3 out of 100 component vulnerabilities that are actually exploitable. And then they'll take over that piece of software, and of course, then they can attack everything else on the network. So you need an S-BOM so you can learn about component vulnerabilities, bug the supplier to patch them, and then, you know, then you're fine. But in the cloud, you're not protecting your network. You know, I mean, the network's the suppliers, the cloud provider's problem. And you know, it doesn't, you know, if they get hacked, well, that's too bad for them. What you are protecting is your data. And because the supplier uses, they got a bunch of third-party components in their software, but the supplier uses a bunch of services, and, you know, third-party services, and those are the source of risk. And so, but there's no NVD for third-party service vulnerabilities like there is for you know, for component vulnerabilities. So on the other hand, there are some kind of databases forming up, but it's those services that you're really concerned about. In fact, I just read about an attack a few weeks ago, which is almost an exact example of that. A service that provides, I forget what, I guess some sort of news feeds to online publications, got themselves hacked, and through them, they attacked the publications themselves, and the publications started spreading malware to their readers. So that's exactly what the case we're dealing with here, as far as I know, in the cloud group.
Yeah, I think we're seeing, when it comes to software supply chain security or third-party risk management, the whole broader conversation, when it comes to like SaaS, for example, there can be a cascading impact. I think the Twilio incident is a good example. There was 130 different SaaS providers or other, parties and services that were impacted as part of that.
By which?
Twilio. That one
Oh,
happened.
okay, Twilio. Okay, yeah.
So I want to ask you too. You mentioned, a couple things you said I thought were interesting. One is like, you didn't want to provide a VEX of, exploited vulnerabilities or exploitable components, for example, because it's kind of a roadmap for the attacker. Some people will say those kind of things.
It would be, yeah.
I think inferences could be made, though. If you give me 100, say you say, hey, these 97 are not exploitable. Well, I'm going to say, I wonder why he didn't include those other 3. Let's take a look at those.
Well, okay. The thing is, no one's publishing this entire list of all the vulnerabilities. But the point is that, it wouldn't be bad if the supplier could just kind of instantly tell which vulnerabilities were exploitable or not, and if that list never changed, there were never any new vulnerabilities discovered and, in the components, et cetera, that's really not a very good assumption. So, to have a list like that would be very, a list of non-exploitable vulnerabilities like the group was imagining would never really happen. Now, we were never really imagining that there would be one list. I mean, basically, I don't see it working. I mean, even the document-based approach doesn't work unless the supplier, as I said, they're never going to learn whether things are vulnerable or not, are exploitable or not right away, because they got to look at the code, they got to do all sorts of things to figure it out. And it may take them a while to figure them out. So, initially, if they give them a complete list, probably most of them will be under investigation, and that's all they'll be able to say. So, but the point is, the end user needs to know as soon as possible that a vulnerability is not exploitable, because otherwise they're going to, this is the big thing about end users. They really want to find out about vulnerabilities in their system, but they don't just kind of want to have a nice list and say, boy, that's nice, we got all these vulnerabilities, now it's time to go home. They want to take that list and they want to feed it into a tool like Qualys or Tripwire or something like that, that's going to go out and actually locate those vulnerabilities and identify that they're really there, because there might be something in the network itself, like a firewall that's blocking what's needed for the vulnerability to be exploited. So they might not be actually a problem on their network. So,
I wanted to ask you about something, because like I come from the DoD space. A lot of my background's in DoD, and we have DoD, Department of Defense.
Oh, DoD, yeah, okay, yeah, I've heard of them, yeah, right.
Yeah, and so obviously the DoD has what's called the Defense Industrial Base, vendors supporting the Department of Defense, and we had certain requirements we had to comply with from NIST, for example, 800-171.
Yeah.
And in that paradigm, it used to be a self-attestation. Like I could self-attest that I'm doing X, Y, and Z. In the concept of VEX, you have a software vendor, kind of self-attesting that something is not exploitable, that it's not vulnerable. Any thoughts around, self-attestation versus a third-party attestation when it comes to exploitability in a piece of software?
The S-BOM itself, there's no, no one's checking them, and it would be a nightmare to require checking or verification at this point. Yes. Right now, no supplier I know of is distributing S-BOMs to their customers on a regular basis. There are few who will give their customers an S-BOM for the product they're using if they ask for it, and that's pretty much it. So, or there's some who give one to a repository and it sits there, and as I said, it's going to be out of date in 3 weeks. So, all of a sudden we say, well, now you can't, you also have to have this group where somebody check your S-BOM and make sure every component is there. For one thing, there's a real technical problem that makes that impossible. But even if you could really check and figure them out, you would never, you know, you're gonna, well, the suppliers will say, well, I gotten through 50 years without the, well, usually not too many suppliers are 50 years old, but 10 years with not giving S-BOMs to my customers, and I guess I'll get through another 10 years. It won't kill me. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, you can't regulate a new technology into existence. Maybe 10 years from now, when S-BOMs are all over the place, knock on wood, and, then we can start worrying about regulation and verification and things like that. Right now, that's the best way to kill the industry, which isn't there anyway. So,
Yeah, I agree. It would be
yeah.
be so cumbersome and bureaucratic that it would drown.
Well, but the other point is, why would they? What's their incentive to do that? Because if they don't tell customers about a serious vulnerability and then someone gets hacked, boy, they are going to be in big trouble, obviously. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, I just don't. Some are very unscrupulous. Well, actually, there's a much bigger danger, which is that they won't report they won't give out S-BOMs, and they won't report any vulnerabilities at all to the NVD. So, and that's the real issue. In fact, Tom Pace from NetRise, I don't know whether you know him, I have this group called the S-BOM Forum, which basically meets once a week to discuss problems. In fact, we meet in 3 hours, 3 hours, and discuss problems that are holding back S-BOMs, including the ones we're talking about now, and holding back distribution and use of S-BOMs. As I said, as far as production of S-BOMs goes, suppliers are producing them, left and right, for their own internal use. They're not giving them to anybody else. And so, it's not because they're evil people, it's because, they see all these problems. So, but anyway, Tom Pace talked to the group, and he talked about a particular line of products of network devices, which is actually, used a lot in OT environments, including by DoD. And although I don't think in, the high security environments, but he said that there are about 50 devices that this vendor makes, or this supplier makes. They, none of them have, if you look in the NVD for all of them, you won't find any vulnerabilities. Now, you won't find the products either, but the NVD unfortunately doesn't tell you, when you do a search on a product, it doesn't tell you, well, that product name isn't valid, or it's not in there. It just says no files found. But that's the same thing it says when it can't find any vulnerabilities. So, you see this no files found and you say, great, this product doesn't have any vulnerabilities. No, the problem is a vulnerability was never reported for it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this group that you've made. I've read some of the recommendations you guys have made, the publications, for example, about the naming problem. Can you walk folks through this naming problem? It seems to be also what you talked about there is like organizations who do their due diligence and put vulnerabilities out there into these databases, could be punitive because they're looked at poorly versus someone who didn't actually contribute any vulnerabilities because they haven't done maybe that due diligence and contribute.
Well, I want to finish my story about Tom Pace, because that's actually part of what I would say in response to this question too. The problem is that this supplier, who makes about 50 devices, has never reported a single vulnerability for any of those devices to the NVD. And that's where most of the CVE reports come from in the NVD, for proprietary products anyway. They come from the supplier itself. And so, there are two conclusions to that. Well, maybe they make perfect products and they never have any vulnerabilities, or perhaps they just don't even care about security. And if you look on their website, they don't even mention security or vulnerabilities or anything like that. So one tends to think the latter, but Tom Pace decided to figure out for himself, and he looked at, he works a lot on firmware, S-BOM, or, firmware components. And he identified a bunch of components in firmware on that device, which he knew about and which had, various vulnerabilities. He added up the vulnerabilities that those firmware components had, and the device has 40,000 vulnerabilities, none of which have ever been reported to the NVD. And so again, you'll look at any of those devices and you'll say, nope. Any of those 50 devices, no, we got no vulnerabilities. So, that's the problem. And so, that for one thing, see, that could be fixed in the NVD by better reporting, by saying, well, there are no vulnerabilities for this product versus this product can't be found at all. But there are a bunch of other problems with the NVD. It's not, and it's really with the CPE name that you need to look products up with. CPE, I don't think it was a bad idea to use CPEs, but the problem is, and this is the other, a big problem with S-BOMs too, and this is one of the things that's holding S-BOMs back, and that's why our group decided to address it, is that only about 5% or less, and two major vendors use that figure, of CPEs for components can be found in the NVD. Now, that doesn't mean that the component isn't listed in the NVD, but it just means and because the thing is, the CPE is a centrally administered database, and it's made, there are like 200 CNAs that one of them has to create the CVE record. And, when they enter a CPE name, they might spell it wrong, or they might get, if they entered the version number, it includes the name, the version number of the product, and the supplier, they might say version V2, whereas, someone might be searching on V2.0, okay? And they're not going to find it because it didn't match, and, or if the supplier, and this is a big one, is that, they enter, someone searches on Microsoft. It's not that they won't find Microsoft, but they'll find, I don't know what, 100,000, 200,000 entries probably. But that's because, so great, you've got 200,000 to sort through. Well, to find a particular product, how are you going to figure which one is of the 200,000 is right? So, but they probably, they may have, the product might be entered under Microsoft Incorporated, Microsoft Europe, or something like that. In fact, one of the people, J.C. Hertz, who's a very, very big person in the S-BOM world, had said that she found that when you ask a Microsoft employee what company they work for, she's counted actually 27 different answers she gets. So that's the thing. And the NVD is very tied to that, to knowing exactly how the thing was created. So really, only 5% of lookups in the NVD of components are successful without a bunch of massaging. And right now, everyone does suppliers or consultants who work for the suppliers who are producing S-BOMs. And that's, again, another reason why they're not producing S-BOMs. Okay, yeah, there's the Tom Pace. And his company is called NetRise, Netrise. But in fact, I could send you, if you want later, a list of, URLs. Are you? Well, I don't know whether you can publish them or whatever, but
yeah, I can drop them in the chat, and so people, even if they've, anyone that was tuned into this and have, been watching it all, even, as they move on and we wrap things up, they can come back and see the comments. So if you want to share those.
Okay, good. Well, that's right. Yeah, I forgot. Yeah, you can do that. Okay, so, but anyway, so we have all these, there are all these problems. Oh, well, yeah, there are all these problems with the CPE names. And so our group, which in this matter, and in fact probably in all of them, is, Steve Springett is the real leader, and he he's also one of the maintainers of what's called Perl, P-U-R-L, called package URL, which is that's the basis for the Sonatype database, open source database. This is a in fact, I'm going to write a post about this soon. This is basically a database where it doesn't require any central maintenance. It's not really a database at all. It's a way of naming things. But the point is, what you really want, and the example is chemical compounds. There's no central database for chemical compounds, except there is, but that's just for really complicated ones. If you want to know what dihydrous oxide is, someone refers to dihydrous oxide, a chemist, and another chemist wants to know what he's referring to, which compound. They know what that is, because it means there's 2 hydrogen molecules and 1 oxygen molecule. And by the way, that's water. So H2O. So when one chemist writes H2O, another one knows what it means. And, obviously that's a bad example because everyone knows what H2O means, but, when you get to the others, it doesn't. So there's no central person telling them this is what it means, and there's no person who can make mistakes. It's, the supplier who writes it the chemist who writes the component name may make a mistake, but that's unfortunately that's always going to happen. So so this is a very deterministic, so Perl basically operates on the same idea. It takes the name of the repository where the software was located. Now, right now, that's just open source. Now, in our paper, we've got a way to address closed source or proprietary software as well. But basically, it's the package manager where the software was downloaded from. And there's the name of the product in the package manager. And that's the important thing, that, the names of a open source product will vary by, often by the package manager. And so or sometimes, and so you want to, you have to have not only the name of the package manager, obviously where you found it, but the name in that package manager. But that because you downloaded it. When you're trying to look up vulnerabilities in a product, you see the Perl, and you go to that package manager and you download the product with that name, and you have the exact same software. And so
I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you a quick, kind of like a practical question, I guess. So, I get the food analogy we often use, like in terms of food and nutrition labels, and the chemical compound one is a great example too. But we live in a society where most people don't look at those labels. They're not concerned with the dyes or the sulfates in their products, for example. I'd imagine most software consumers may not really be too interested in the components, even though maybe they should be. But many may not be. We live in an abstracted society where everything is as a service, for example, in the digital era that we are in now. How do we, do you think it's a matter of raising awareness, or do you think it'll always be a case where, maybe only really sensitive industries or, federal regulated industries and DoD and so on, some organizations just might not pay enough attention?
No, I think, no, I think there's tons of attention. The people, but what are they going to do with them right now with a machine readable S-BOM? Now some suppliers are putting out S-BOMs in just PDF form, non-machine readable, but and that's better than nothing. And but you really need something automated, because what you want to really do for any medium to large size company, as I said, they're using something like Qualys or ServiceNow or Tripwire, to manage their vulnerabilities. They really want to feed, they want to get a list of exploitable vulnerabilities, that is, vulnerabilities that have had the VEX items subtracted out. And that's where we get into real-time VEX. We can talk about that. But in any case, they want exploitable vulnerabilities, not the 3%, not the 97%, for every product they have. I mean, ideally, that would be great. Every piece of software they run, they would have that. They would feed it into Qualys or whatever, and Qualys would go out and they would look to see if those vulnerabilities were there or not, and figure out what they're going to do, and then only then would they then contact the supplier and say, when are you going to fix this? Which is fine with the suppliers. I mean, they want to hear about the real problems. They don't, the 3% that are real, they don't want to hear about the 97% that aren't real. But right now, there's no way the end user can know they're not real without having a VEX document, except VEX documents are pretty much a mirage at this point. They will be real, but okay, Cyclone DX are real, but in any case, they won't be able to do anything without a tool to ingest the S-BOM, feed it into those vulnerability management products, then or feed the vulnerabilities in those vulnerability management products, then it's pretty much useless. And so I mean, there's not much interest in that. And there's another thing that Tony Turner pointed out to me on LinkedIn a while ago, is that supplier customers are overwhelmed right now with vulnerabilities they got to trace down. And now we're going to say, oh, well, now you've got these bunch, fine, all you know about right now are the vulnerabilities that are in the code written by the supplier. Now, that's not necessarily true, because hopefully the supplier is reporting exploitable vulnerabilities to the NVD, but of course they won't exploit them. They won't report them until there's a patch, but they will be doing that hopefully. But the point is that you won't know about those. You won't be able to do anything with that information that's really useful until you have a tool that can do this carryover from, read the S-BOM, look up the vulnerabilities, remove the vulnerabilities that aren't exploitable, send the final list over to Qualys or to ServiceNow, and then and I'm not endorsing those products, of course, but and then that product will look them up. Now, the one thing that you would be able to bypass that all of that if the Qualyses, etc., themselves ingested S-BOMs and VEXs and to look them up. That's been a wall against which Alan Friedman has been beating his head for 3 years, and he's come up. It's basically not worked at all. I mean, they're not interested in doing that.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a lack of demand among the their customer base and consumers who are just not asking for these features and capabilities, or what's driving that. And I wanted to ask you a question too. I know you have
I mean, that's one thing that's driving it there, that they can't do anything with the S-BOM when they get it.
I want to ask you. We've talked a lot about NVD, CVE, CNAs, and things of that nature. You mentioned OSS Index, for example. What are your thoughts on some of the other emerging vulnerability databases like Global Security Database from Cloud Security Alliance, OSV, for example? What are your thoughts on some of these other emerging, vulnerability databases outside of NVD? Why do you think we're seeing of these alternatives, and what role will they play?
Well, as I said, as far as I know, OSS Index is a much more useful database than the NVD. But basically, they're all you ought to use information from wherever you can get it. So, and as far as I know, OSS Index imports all the stuff from the NVD. Well, there's VulnDB, which is basically the NVD cleaned up. of course, cleaning it up completely is probably impossible, but they do, they fix a lot of these problems that I was talking about, and so that helps. But as I said, it really, and as far, except for vulndb, other than the NVD, no one uses CPE names, and they're not going to either. None of these databases. They're all I don't know what the others are on, but I mean, I know Perl is, OSS Index is the largest open source database, and that's all based on Perl. So, and that's why we based our naming proposal, that is the S-BOM forum, based our proposal on Perl. So, yeah, no, I mean, there's all these, it's great to have all these databases. The problem is the NVD is so hard to deal with. And, and the whole problem is that, this stuff has to be operationalized. You can't, like with the naming problem right now, as I said, people have to use AI, and they have to use, fuzzy logic, and they have to use, databases, various random databases where they can pull information out of that might be, they try to guess what the CPE name is, and, they can use prayer or whatever will work for them. And, and it seems to do well. I mean, most suppliers will tell you, yeah, we've got the problem of making S-BOM, and especially the third-party vendors too. We've got the problem fixed, or mostly addressed, but it's because they're doing all this magic on the side. Well, unfortunately, you can't ask every software users in the world to do all this magic on their own. S-BOMs have to be completely operational, where you just, you have to have a tool, you feed it in, it's got to do everything, period. And right now, I don't see any alternative, but I really don't think there are going to be real usable tools for at least 2 or 3 years. And because, as I said, the naming problem really has to be fixed. We have submitted a proposal, is now being considered by MITRE and by CISA, who really, CISA, they hold the purse strings to the NVD. And CISA is going to come out with a paper this year, which hopefully will incorporate some of our suggestions. And and we're not, by the way, saying that CPE needs to go away. It can continue fine. And if you like your CPE, keep using CPE. But Perls, the idea is Perls would be in there as well in the NVD. So, but the thing is, S-BOMs have to be operationalized, both on the production side, because they're not, again, you can't produce an S-BOM that's usable now without having a solution to the naming problem. But, and then on the consumption side, they need to be operationalized. And that's where they really work. But unfortunately, we are talking about a long time before that's the case. And for that reason, I think initially, certainly for the first 2 or 3 years, it's going to be third-party vendors who are, and hopefully that provide services on a subscription basis, not on an hourly basis, because that's just not going to be affordable. Who provide services, and they can do all this magic on their own. But the thing is, they'll have a big customer base, and they can amortize that cost over a huge bunch of customers, as opposed to having to do this custom stuff for every customer they got. So that's that's where I see basically the tools basically are not really going to be there for a few years. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think you point out a number of challenges and hurdles we need to overcome as an industry. Both logistically and technologically from a tool perspective. So I wanted to ask, like I said, I've been a longtime follower of your blog, but we're almost at the end of our time here. For folks that haven't been following you yet or want to follow you and your content, your thoughts on the topic of software supply chain, S-BOM, VEX, where can folks find you? What's the best outlet to try to follow you?
It's Tom Alrich's blog. Yeah, I mean, I always, other platforms like Energy Central and, podcasts and webinars. I'm doing a webinar on VEX on the 30th, but I always announce everything in my blog. So the blog is called Tom Alrich's blog. It's a very, very ingenious name that I had to pay Ernst & Young a lot of money to come up with that name, and it was worth every penny, I'll tell you. So, I do want to point out that I don't think
a link to your blog here in the chat below. I said I'm dropping a link to your blog in the chat below for folks.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, Tom Alrich's blog, or you can just Google my name and you'll find it. So I do want to mention that I don't think all these problems, like the naming problem, have to be solved before S-BOMs are going to be distributed, but they have to be on their way to solution. And there are only 3 or 4 real showstoppers. Like VEX is one of them, and we didn't get time to talk about real-time VEX, but if you do a search on my blog, you'll find, just put real-time VEX and you'll find it. But they don't have to be solved, but they have to be on their way to solution. At least there's a way is being point forward, and people, and not everyone will, but at least the ones who are most concerned about component vulnerabilities will actually, start. Oh, there we go. Oh, yeah. Okay, you got it. So, but at least the people who really need it will start getting S-BOMs, and and then it'll spread out to the people who are less concerned about it. But already, there's huge interest, and of course, like DoD and others are using S-BOMs a lot now, but they're basically paying consultants a lot of money to make it usable, and that just can't. Everybody doesn't have those kind of budgets to do that, so that's the problem. But I think in 4 or 5 years, there will be tools, and there will be third-party services, and S-BOMs will be heavily used. I don't have any real doubt about that. Well, okay. Anyway, I believe it will happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we're going to see an evolution in the tooling, in the managed service offerings, and the vendors and their capabilities and things of that nature. But that said, thank you so much for coming on, Tom. I've been a long-time reader of your blog, and I'll be continuing to follow your thoughts. And thanks for everyone who tuned in as well.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I've enjoyed doing this. All right. Okay.